Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of death metal, checking out the band Morbid Angel. That's a band name, but you know what? For a death metal band, I think Morbid Angel sort of works well at conveying the right kind of energy that helps you know what you're getting into. I don't think I'd have this confused for anything else. So, let's dive into this. We're going to be checking out the track Summoning Redemption. Let's dive into this and see what's going on. Really interesting, the rhythmic layering between our two guitars. It kind of obscures where the downbeat is too. So it makes, when we get to this section, the clarity of it becomes a strong component as it stands in contrast. But even on our left guitar, it kind of slides into the downbeat.
Come now with sleeping visions. Come now in needed time. I demand to stand before you. Princess wells decay. I demand to know.
Yeah, very cool layering.
I demand to see this corrosion wipe away.
Yeah, another interesting one.
When the slithering begins, celebrate crown with me. The light of dawn is glowing. A realization centered.
The dragon just a hair. I was suspicious of it in our last verse, but I'm confident of it now. There's something I can't quite put my finger on. very cool. A bit of a key shift as well. Well, I guess we'd call it modal layering. The foundational guitars haven't changed at all. Oh, we're gonna have to talk about them solos. That's a neat idea. Hmm. All right. I'm kind of thinking this is more traditional death than we had yesterday with Death's modern take from their later album. One of their later albums. Might have been their latest. I can't remember now. Um, I'm curious. When did this come out? 2000. Huh. Okay. So my whole I had this whole thing formulated that this would have just been earlier in the death metal history. Um, and so it was playing around with ideas a bit more, and it would have been during that innovative stage, probably before death metal as a label had come out, and when ideas were just being played around with to see where they could take the current sound of metal, and just a highly experimental era of the genre. But no, this is new. This came out in 2000. It blows my mind because there's a lot of things in here that I don't think work, that I think are better understood as ideas of experimentation that might not necessarily have been fruitful, but were interesting just by the sheer fact of their creation. There's just a lot of this song that doesn't work for me. So let's get into this. I think this is overall going to be a fairly critical look on this track. Um, so if if you don't like your favorite music being analyzed deeply and hearing somebody say they don't like these aspects of the track, now's a good time to find somebody else who's gonna ooh and ah over it because they enjoyed it. All right, for everyone who's left, there are some really interesting ideas going on in here. And the first thing I want to touch on is the time, the metric component. It's wildly disjointed at every moment of this track. We start off with this really cool idea where we have these two chugs on our right guitar, followed by a downbeat strike on our left guitar. Um, and so it kind of feels like we have this little bit of a gallop, right? We have two notes into the emphasized downbeat, and we're getting this in sort of a parallel manner, call and response, where we hear the lead in and then the downbeat, and then the lead in and then the downbeat. It almost feels like what galloping would be on the bass kick that we would hear in a lot of metal, maybe around the time, maybe earlier. I don't know when galloping became prevalent, but it's that digadoo, 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 those tight groupings of three, and that's kind of what we have here. But what's interesting is that it's not a tight grouping, it's kind of a loose grouping of this three. Um, and this is the beginning of my criticism of the timeless playing that's going on here. They have these really cool ideas that I think if it was done by a tech death band or anybody else who was focused on the perfection of the execution, it would come off as something a bit more robotic, but also clean. And what we end up with here is something that is not a perfect grouping of three, so it makes the downbeat feel odd. It removes the emphasis from it. If you're really listening to just the left guitar and the drum kit, I think you'd feel a bit of an emphasis there. But if you're listening to both guitars in tandem, like I think they want you to, given that they're in the spotlight, the drums are kind of pushed down into the mix a little bit, you're going to feel a bit disjointed, unbalanced. There is just a slight bit of playing out of time that's going on. That seems to be consistent. So maybe it was purposefully done, and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt on this. I really do. And I think I did at the beginning. I mentioned how it was a really neat idea that they were going for there that obscured the downbeat. It wasn't until I listened to more sections throughout the track that I realized their timing is a bit sloppy in every section, and again, that could be intentional to create an overall vibe of this imperfection, but at least right here in that knowledge that everything is a bit off throughout the track, it ends up making this riff feel a bit sloppy. And we'll get to this in the future again because this riff is utilized under the guitar solos, which, oh, we got to talk about that whole section. But this is the introduction to this idea. We shift off of this into a much slower riff, and the tempo hasn't changed, just the amount of attacks we have did. And the thing here is that when you have less attacks, you have less landmarks for the tempo. So you really have to either have a really good internal metronome, you need to record with a click track or a metronome. Being that this was 2000, probably click track would have been more accurate. But again, it's metal, and playing against a click track is not very metal unless you're in a progressive or technical genre. Um, so we end up with a section where everybody kind of comes in generally at the same time for these downbeat accents, but not at the same time. And it just ends up feeling very sloppy, and we bounce back and forth between these two. Then we get to the what? There was a new section. It was a bridge, and I don't remember what was going on in it. But this is the moment I think when it really clicked for me. Like everybody's just kind of off. And this is where I started retroactively applying it, and then we re-hit the verse and the chorus again. And I was like, "Yep, yeah, for sure." And I think it's just one of those bands where if you enjoy what they're doing, everything being slightly off, having that human component to it, that imperfection, is going to amplify the song for you. If it was played perfectly, it would not be as interesting, it would not be as good, and that is a completely valid way to approach this track. And much like it, there's a lot of metal out there where they're not focused too much on the perfection of rhythmic attacks. We've even had a few on the channel, and I say the same thing every time. If you enjoy what they're doing, and if they're happy with their output, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Everything is a tool in a toolbox. Perfection is just a way that you can play a song. And sometimes you can be imperfect for added effect. And that could be what's happening here. It's just not my cup of tea, and at least for me, it's distracting and takes away from it. Whereas maybe for you, it improves the song. Um, but yeah, from this point on, it was just extremely clear to me that everybody was just slightly off. It's good. It's not as bad as like a doom metal band playing at 30 BPMs and trying to stay in time with such a slow tempo. Um, Everything is generally close together here, and the song never feels like it's falling apart. It's more of that kind of thing, at least for me. Once I noticed it, then it became super distracting. But prior to that, it was just a neat little thing that was going on. Now, I mentioned that we need to talk about the guitar solo. That is what's coming next. We take our opening verse riff, that galloping parallel guitar line idea, and we put music on top of it. Now, by itself, the lack of rhythmic cohesion between our three instruments wasn't that jarring. It obscured the downbeat for sure, but it could have been seen as an artistic or thematic element. It was just a component of that style. But then to put a melody on top of it, especially a fast moving melody like our solo, really makes everything feel like it begins to fall apart. We have too many moving pieces that aren't in line with each other at this point. And I think this was most seen in our first solo when we shifted to our other guitarist. I don't think it was as bad because the other guitarist decided to just shred. And at that point, you don't even really need to worry about time because the attacks are coming so fast. One of them is going to land on the same part of the downbeat that the rest of the band is landing on. So that kind of obscures it a little bit more. But with the slower melodic solo of our first guitarist, it really stands out. And the song, at least to me, felt like it was on the verge of teetering, of completely falling apart. It was teetering. That's the word. It wasn't on the verge of teetering. It was teetering on the verge of falling completely. Um, and it just, that solo was very difficult for me to listen to. But the timing and rhythmic concept of it all wasn't the only thing that was a bit jarring. Something really clicked for me here. A lot of metal, not all of metal, but certainly metal that sounds like this. Not necessarily death metal, but metal that uses a small range of notes for their core riffs, might even all be within the same octave, that expands the notes selected for the solo. A lot of metal bands do this, and to me it's always jarring because it sets the solo off as something separate, and it never really clicked to me why I wasn't a fan of solos like this until just now. And it's not like I haven't said this before. The solo came in and said, oh, they did a mode shift. And then it clicked. I was like, it's not really a modal shift, though. The underlying guitar work is the same we've already heard. We're just adding extra notes into it to take it away from probably a pentatonic idea, which is just a 5-note scale, to a larger scale. And in this case, I think we move towards Phrygian. Or something Phrygian, maybe Phrygian dominant, because it had a little bit of that flair, but it didn't have that full-on Middle Eastern kind of vibes. And Phrygian dominant sort of fits that bill. Anyways, the idea is we took the notes that we already had, the 5 that we had, and we probably added 2 or 3 more on top of that to create our new chord that our new key that we would use to create the melody of the solo. And it feels distinct from the rest of the song. It key shifts, mode shifts, these are really major aspects of a song. They completely shift the tone and atmosphere of a section. They need to be wielded with sort of respect. You can certainly just toss them in willy-nilly and call it experimental or avant-garde, but if you want to actually gain the emotional aspects out of these shifts and utilize them to their maximum, you need to understand what they're bringing to the table and how it changes the song, where you were, and its contrast to where you're going. And with a lot of guitar solos, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like we're just flushing out something and we should have either stuck with the more minimal idea or we should have been using the fleshed out version the whole time. And that's probably just my predisposition towards technical and progressive metals that tend to use larger keys and modes than what more standardish metal ideas tend to utilize. Um, and like I said earlier, if you listen to the solo and you're like, I love it. I love when they do that. I love when they go to that solo and I love when they come back. It's all perspective, right? Your perspective's just as valid as mine. And if you enjoy it, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with bands who do this. It's just, it really isn't my cup of tea because it feels so disconnected from the rest of the track. Um, which is even stranger when we get to our second soloist and they seem to then pick notes from outside the key, which not only it increases the dissonance of it, but feels like we've gone even further from our root, from our foundation. Which, if there's a thematic reason for, I can get behind. If you're trying to pull in different emotional elements, I can get behind that. If it's just done for aesthetic purposes, maybe I can get behind it. But here it just kind of feels like the guitarist wanted to do their own thing and it didn't match with the key we were in. It didn't match with the speed we were in. It didn't match with the rhythmic concepts that were going on underneath it. There were just a lot of elements of the melody in both of the solos, but primarily in our second solo, that just had no regard for anything that was going on around it. And that's what really takes me out of these moments. And I think what makes me appreciate more melodic or melody driven metal, especially more modern metal, is that there is I don't want to say a stronger appreciation for, and I don't want to say that it's purposefully being ignored, or maybe they don't even know they're ignoring it. Like, I don't want to get into the intention of it, because I don't want to put words in these composers' mouths, but at least to me, modern metal tends to understand that the solo and the underlying foundational element need to work in tandem, that the melody can't just exist. And it almost sounds like, especially in this case, especially with the second guitarist, they just wrote a sick solo off, and the solo's not wrong. The solo's not bad. It's actually a really great solo. It just doesn't really fit in this specific case. And it almost feels like they just wrote this really sick solo on their own. Without specifically creating it for this section. And maybe it sounded really good and they just record it and they're like, we need a solo for Summoning Redemption. And he's like, oh, I wrote this sick one yesterday, put that in there. And they just pasted it in there, and it's just, it has no regard for the foundational elements. It clashes sonically, it clashes emotionally, it clashes atmospherically, it clashes rhythmically. It feels really out of place. And it really, the whole solo section put a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. Now that's not to say that the whole song is negative, and I don't usually like to start with the negatives, but to me they were the most prominent component of this song, there were some really cool things going on in here. First of all, we had vocal harmonies, harsh vocal harmonies, which is very cool. I ask for those all the time. I really think they're underutilized. Vocal harmonies are something we are finally seeing more of, at least to me, in rock and lighter metals, less extreme metals. And they've always been there. I'm not saying that this is just a new thing, but it seems like for a long time, aside from features, there was always just one vocalist. And we're starting to see more of that, I feel, which is really good for me. But layered harsh vocals are still not something we see too often, and at least to me, it's a bit of a shame. I think it's phenomenal. Any layering is great. Any contrast is great, at least to my ears. So, just having multiple harsh vocal styles working in tandem always sounds good, and I love to hear. I would have liked a little bit more of it, but for 2000, I don't think there were many bands doing it back then. And if there were, dude, we need to have a dual screamer week so you guys can show this stuff to me. Um, but I really appreciate that. And we did have some really nice guitar harmonies in the beginning of our bridge as well that I was really enjoying. There was some riffs in our bridge that I thought were really neat. There's a lot of components here that I think work well on their own, but it's when they begin to start layering ideas that things start to fall apart. So the flatter sections I thought worked well. I'm not a big fan of that sort of static metal of the guitars doing a riff and the bass doing a pedal tones, and then the drums just kind of doing straight drum work. It's not my favorite type of metal. I want something a bit more contrasty. But as far as this type of metal goes, I think they were really nailing it. There's some really neat stuff in here, lots of headbangable moments, really great groove at times, lots of power and energy. Like, all the basics are there. It's every time they started to take a step above that, I think things started to fall apart just a little bit, which again, it kind of leads into that idea that I expected this to be a bit more of the experimental era. If this, and it could be, this could be Morbid Angel's experimental era the rather than proto black metal, which I think is what I was expecting this to be classified as. Um, it has that experimental feel. What if we did this? What if we did that? What if we changed modes between our two solos? What if we rhythmically pushed against all the instruments? There's a lot of really neat what if experiments in here, and I don't think many of them ended up panning out. But that's kind of the thing about experimentation, is not everything is going to stick, but you're tossing so many things at the wall, and sometimes just that raw creativity is enough to um, create the spark of innovation that leads to something great. So I don't want to say this is a bad song, because it certainly isn't. To me, it feels eclectic and it feels adventurous, and I don't ever want to put that down. It might confuse me. It might not be something I want to listen to again, but experimentation is extremely important to any art form. And that's where I want to place this, at least in my mind. Now, you guys are free to tell me this is just their style, there's nothing experimental about it. Okay, if that's the case, then it is. But to me, at least right now, with no extra information, this feels experimental in interesting ways. So I'm going to hit the lyrics here and see what's going on there and wrap this up. One thing I forgot to bring up was atmosphere, which I think, aside from the tonal shift in the solos, was hit pretty spot on. This is a dark, heavy, constantly pushing forward sound. There's moments of levity, not necessarily in weight, but in spacing, where it almost feels like the song stops for a moment. And that was those long, drawn out sections that I was talking about. But they're placed sparsely in between sections that, like I had mentioned, have a ton of energy and forward momentum and groove. This is a song that has a dark atmosphere, but it's always pushing forward, which feels a lot like what these lyrics are going on about. It's a bit of a shame I didn't get to talk about those beforehand, but it's going to tie it nicely into this. The song appears to be about someone or something. It doesn't quite say who the I is, but it is told from first person. And this person stands before the gods of all pristine, as stated in our first stanza, calls them a flock of tyrants, and says that he brings vengeance. Says he's going to cleanse the world's decay. The chorus, which only comes up twice, interestingly, says, I demand to know the light of a promised land. I demand to see this corrosion wiped away. So pretty clearly, there is filth in this world, and they're going to eradicate it so that they can see at least what they expect to be is a more beautiful world, one filled of light, calls it a promised land. Verse 3, 4, and 5 speaks of a cleansing and the filth of the world. A lot of people, it seems, trying to crawl away and crying and trying to reason with this person as they bring this uh, vengeance across the land. And the realization that these people have that everything that they built is now rubble and that there is no escaping this death. That's that's what it's about. It's about some dude powerful enough, or something, like I said, powerful enough to eradicate anyone that he deems as less than clean. Anything that he deems as worsening to the world. And it really fits with that vibe. There's a darkness, there's a malevolence to it. That's the vengeance. And it doesn't really stop. It takes those pauses. The first one, I think, happens right after he speaks to the gods of all pristine. And it's sort of a moment, I think, where he allows his grievances to be aired. I don't remember where the second one came in to know what lyrics would be around it, but for the most part, though, the rest of the track is all energy, all pushing forward. It's just this sweeping vengeance across the land. And I think the music does a pretty good job of musically illustrating that, both the feeling of this, the raw power of it, and the event itself. All right, so those are my thoughts on Morbid Angel's Summoning Redemption. What'd you think? Anything that stood out to you? Anything you'd like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Let me know down in the comments. Above that is a description box. In there you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you to this menu right here. You can find my music, ways to support the channel, the Discord server, and so much more. Go ahead and check that out. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three. We have a special selection coming out today. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 p.m. UTC, as usual. We'll continue on with Death Metal Week and look at another special selection. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.